Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingrassia.
Hey you guys, Tony here. Welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I'm really glad that you could be with me for this episode as we continue to work our way through understanding your story. And before we get into today's episode, I thought I'd take a moment and share with you a very brief note that I got from a brother, actually from another country. And he says, "Hello, I came across your site. I've been struggling with porn and masturbation for some time now and have tried hard to stop. Most of my efforts have been short-lived. I believe it's time to form a group to help myself and others. Can you give some suggestions or advice of how to move forward? I'm a Christian living in Trinidad." So I was very happy to get this note from this brother, and of course I responded back and tried to give him some information and guidance on how he might consider getting a few brothers together to start a group around the topic of sexual purity. And in view of that, I just want to share my heart and say a few words about this. You know, one of the key principles that we learn pretty early in the healing process is this concept of into the light. I believe that if you're really serious about your journey of sexual purity, that you're going to realize that it's a journey that you can't do alone. I believe God calls us to live in community, to live in a place of honesty and transparency and vulnerability and authenticity, or we might just say keeping it real with some other key friends and brothers in our life. And I might suggest that this is sometimes an issue in the church because so often I think there can be a high level of pretense in the church. So everybody gathers together on Sunday morning, right? We all clean up pretty good and we look pretty good and we ask each other, "How you doing?" And we all have our happy face and we say, "Oh, I'm doing fine. Everything's going great." And we sit there and we watch church, we participate, then we leave and we go home. And the fact is, the most recent statistics tell us that 68% of Christian men are viewing pornography on a regular basis. 55% of married Christian men are viewing pornography on a regular basis. And 50% of pastors are viewing porn on a regular basis. So this issue is a pretty serious issue in the context of church, and it's a pretty serious issue in the context of many Christian men's hearts and lives, if not most. And therefore, I have no doubt that there's a whole lot of brothers that need help with this. And a problem is that so many guys, they want to keep this a secret. They don't want anybody to know about their struggle. And what I'm telling you guys, and I'm sorry if I'm the bearer of bad news, but I just believe that, well, there's an old adage in AA, I think it says, you're only as sick as your secrets. And at some point, if you're serious about your journey of purity, you're going to realize that you can't keep secrets anymore, and you're going to have to come into the light with somebody. And this doesn't mean, in my estimation, that you have to go around and blab your junk and your struggle and your issues to everybody and anybody, but it does mean that you're going to have to come into the light, 100% absolute transparency and honesty and vulnerability and keeping it real with at least one other trusted person. Might be a counselor, might be your pastor, might be a spiritual mentor or advisor or a friend. But you can't keep your secrets any longer, and you're going to have to disclose to somebody who you really are as a sexual person and the things that have happened to you and the things that you yourself have done. You come into the light because God is light and God lives in the light, and God's healing is in the light. It's not in the darkness. So that means if you want God's healing, you've got to move into the light. So all that just to say that I really appreciate this brother's heart that he's interested in the possibility of forming a group, he says, to help himself and to help others. And I just want to encourage some of you guys out there to consider this as a possibility. Did you know that where you go to church, wherever that is, how many guys are struggling with this in their heart and in their life in this day and age? Do you know how many guys are struggling with internet pornography? As I just said, latest statistics tell us that 68% of Christian men view porn on a regular basis. And you know what that means? I could walk into any church in America, and I can look at the congregation, and I could say, okay, guys, here's what I want you to do. Look to your right and find the closest man in your row at church, and then look to your left, find another man. In other words, just look around you and identify 2 other men. So now there's 3 of you in church, right? Those other 2 men and you. And what I'm telling you guys, of you 3 brothers, 2 of you are looking at pornography on a regular basis. And what that means is that if you are not looking at porn on a regular basis, then you know what the other 2 guys are doing. So the problem is epidemic, and there's a lot of brothers that need help. So what I'm saying is it conceivable that some brothers, just like this brother in Trinidad, what if you would become the catalyst to starting a Power of Purity group? What if you had the courage to reach out to a couple brothers, maybe that are close to you, to dare to be honest and to disclose and say, hey, I'm kind of struggling with some issues around this, and I'm wondering, I just want to get a couple brothers together and we can meet every week or every 2 weeks, and let's just talk about this, and let's start praying about this, and let's seek God together, and let's become healthier men together. And I just believe that there's a blessing of God and an anointing of God and a power of God in that, because God promises when we join together, when we meet together, that His presence is with us in an unusual way that I believe it isn't when I'm just by myself. When we gather together, the presence of Christ is with us. And so let me just say it this way, you guys. And I'm not presuming when I say this. I want to give a disclaimer in a moment. But at this point, we have over 60 episodes of the Power of Purity podcast. And there's 52 weeks a year, right? 52 weeks. So let's just say, theoretically, if you got 2 or 3 other brothers, or 4 or 5, there's a group of 4, 5, 6, 8 of you guys, and you decide we're going to meet every week. Well, what are we going to talk about? My point is this, that if you have no other resource or material, then what if you just got together and you listened to one episode of the Power of Purity podcast together? They're about 30 minutes long, as you know. And then you just talked about it for another 30 minutes or an hour. And you talked about how the principle that we're discussing in the podcast applies to your life and situation. And you just start working through this material together with a few brothers. And again, my disclaimer is this, that I don't presume that my material is so fantastic that you have to use my material. You could use the podcast. You could use my books. You could purchase the Power of Purity video conference. There's 30 sessions there, and you could work through those 30 sessions together. Or forget the Power of Purity. Go out and just find another book or another teaching, another seminar about sexual purity, but just together with a group of brothers begin to work on this issue together. And I'm not sure who this is for. I trust that it's for somebody, because to be honest with you, I didn't even intend to talk about this when I started this episode today, but it's just kind of coming out of me. So I trust that maybe God wanted me to say this, to speak to somebody, to speak to a brother, or maybe several brothers, that could rally some brothers together, and we've got to pass the word, and we've got to get a momentum going, we got to get a movement going, we've got to reach out to these 68% of Christian men who are viewing internet pornography on a regular basis, and we need to try to carry the message of purity to more men. So think about it, pray about it. If the shoe fits, wear it. And with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the intended format of today's podcast. And as you guys know, I've been working my way through a series of episodes entitled Understanding Your Story. I've got 16 principles that I'm sharing with you. We are currently on principle 14, which is 12 suggestions on letting God into your stories. And through last episode, we've covered the first 11, and that brings us to principle 12 of the 12 suggestions of letting God into your stories. And principle 12 is this: you must surrender these stories to God. Or said another way, after you identify the most painful and shameful stories of your life, and you begin to face those stories, and you enter those stories, you're exploring those stories, you're understanding your stories, you're beginning to talk about your stories, you're beginning to feel your stories, you're inviting God into your stories and believing that God is with you on this journey into your stories, and you're hearing what God has to say to you about your stories, and you're renouncing certain things in your stories that needs to be renounced from your life. As the 12th and final step, you then surrender these stories to God, the most painful and shameful stories of your life. And in the way of illustration or metaphor, I'm just picturing here the metaphor of a bowling ball. So imagine this. What if I was holding a heavy bowling ball, and not only that, but I've been holding this heavy bowling ball for a very, very long time, and I've been carrying it around with me, literally living my life with this heavy bowling ball for the past 30 years. Because it's always there, it's always with me, it never goes away. And this bowling ball, of course, is not a positive thing in my life. In fact, it's a negative thing because it's heavy and it holds negative power in my life and my soul, like maybe hurt and confusion and disorientation or pain and shame. But then somehow I come to this incredible, significant, beautiful, awesome day when I come to understand and I realize that I don't have to carry this heavy bowling ball with me anymore. I can literally give this bowling ball over to God. And God's right there with me. He's willing to take the bowling ball from me. And not only that, but He wants to take the bowling ball from me. And He will take the bowling ball from me. Praise be to God. Can you think of any reason, in view of this metaphor, that you wouldn't want to go ahead and give this stupid bowling ball over to God? And I'd advocate that this is what catharsis is, that I've been referencing in our earlier episodes of this series, Understanding Your Story. Catharsis is the process of releasing something. You see, something that's been on you, but now you want it off of you, so you're going to release it. You've had this heavy bowling ball, but you're going to release it now. Catharsis. Catharsis is the process of releasing and therefore providing yourself relief from strong or repressed emotions. And I believe that ultimately this is the very reason that we're doing this whole process that we've been talking about, that we're seeking to let God into the most painful and shameful stories of our lives so that we can not only hear what God has to say about our stories and our life, but we can also surrender and release these stories of our lives over to God so we can experience God's forgiveness and His healing and redemption, and we can experience catharsis accordingly. So in the way of a quick review of Principle 14 of the 16 principles, Principle 14 is 12 suggestions on letting God into your stories. And we've discovered that those 12 principles on how to do that are as follows. Number 1, you identify the most painful and shameful stories of your life. Number 2, you face these stories. Number 3, you enter these stories. Number 4, you explore these stories. Number 5, you understand these stories. Number 6, you talk about these stories. Number 7, you feel these stories. Number 8, you invite God into these stories. Number 9, you believe God is with you in these stories. Number 10, you seek to hear what God has to say to you about the most painful and shameful stories of your life. Number 11, you renounce certain things that happened in the most painful and shameful stories of your life. And number 12, you surrender to God the bowling ball. You surrender to God the most painful and shameful stories of your life. And with all that being said, we finally conclude principle 14 of understanding your story, and that brings us to principle 15 of understanding your story, which is this: the journey into your stories is a messy process. Or said another way, people's lives are messy, and people's stories are messy, and people's feelings are messy, and things are not always black and white, and there's typically a lot of confusion and disorientation and what I might call fog or gray area. So chances are the journey into the most painful and shameful stories of your life is not going to be a linear process from point A to point B, but rather it's going to be 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And then it might be 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, and sometimes it might feel like 1 step forward and 5 steps back. So I'm not suggesting that this journey into your stories with God is necessarily an easy thing or a neat, clean, tidy thing. And as you take this journey, there's a good chance you might begin to feel emotions that you've never felt before, or at least emotions that you've been trying not to feel and you've been trying to avoid. And the process might seem kind of scary to you, and it might cause you to recoil. It might really confuse you and complicate your relationships because, for example, if one of your stories involves your grandfather sexually abusing you, and you decide to journey into that story because now you're facing it and you're entering it and you're beginning to explore it and talk about it and understand it, and you're beginning to feel the feelings that you should be feeling because that happened to you, and you're inviting God into that story with you, and you're beginning to hear what God wants to say to you about that story, you see, all around this one story of your grandfather sexually abusing you, then this process is likely going to lead you to a whole bunch of issues and feelings and questions, kind of like opening up a can of worms. For example, should I confront my grandfather about what he did to me? Or should I continue to keep it a secret from my family? And should I finally tell my parents what Grandpa did to me? And should I tell my brothers and sisters what really happened? And if I do, how's that information going to affect my family? And how will everybody respond to Grandpa? And how will they respond to me? And what if they don't believe me? And what if they call me a liar? What if they say I'm crazy? What if they say Grandpa would never do that? Or what if Grandpa himself denies that he did it to me? What would I do? Can I continue to be in a relationship with Grandpa if he doesn't admit the truth about what he did to me? Is it worth me opening this can of worms? Is it worth hurting my grandmother when she finds out what Grandpa did? Is it worth getting Grandma upset about all of this? And on these questions go and these dilemmas unfold. So you see, when you decide to journey into your stories, there can be profound implications for you and for your family and for your relationships, and it might be a really messy process. And because of this, people might end up getting mad at you, and you might get mad at people that you've never really been mad at before, or you might get really mad at God. You might wonder, God, why didn't you do something about this? Where were you? Why didn't you protect me from what happened to me? And why did you allow it to happen, God? And as you take this journey, you might begin to realize some things about yourself that you really don't like. you might begin to connect the dots about some things about yourself and begin to see yourself more honestly than you ever have before. And you might have to admit some things about yourself that you've never wanted to admit. Or it might include looking at the different ways that different people have hurt you, or the different ways that you have hurt other people. And it might involve seeing how these things have affected your style of relating and who you've been with people, and maybe helping you begin to see and understand how and why, for example, that you've been so controlling in your relationships, or manipulative, or withdrawn, or compliant, or self-protective in your relationships. And the metaphor that I'm seeing here, you guys, is the metaphor of this concept of hoarding. And you know these shows on television about hoarding. It shows these people who are hoarders. And when you see the inside of their house, it's absolutely unbelievable how much stuff these people have in their house. And this stuff is piled up sometimes literally from the floor to the ceiling and from side to side in virtually every room. And you can hardly move around in the house, and you have to literally crawl over mountains of junk and stuff and nasty stuff just to go from room to room. Or said another way, it's messy in there. And what I'm suggesting is that sometimes when we move into our stories, it's going to be messy in there. And what this means is that Principle 15, the journey into your stories, is a messy process. So guess what? In situations like this, it's easy to become overwhelmed. And if you were commissioned to clean up this mess, like the people that go into the house to clean up the hoarding, they're going to try to clean this up. It's almost like you could say to yourself, where do I even start? How do I even do this? Where do I begin? It feels almost impossible. Like, I don't know if I can do this. And I might suggest, therefore, that for many of us, if not for most of us, this is kind of what it might feel like when we finally decide to turn around and face the refrigerator, face the most painful and shameful stories of our lives, and we actually begin to open that door, like the people open the door to move into the hoarding. So we're opening this door to begin moving into the messy stories of our life, that it feels like a metaphorical hoarding situation. And there's all these piles of junk and stuff stacked all over the place. It seems overwhelming. And in a word, it seems really messy. And all I can say here, guys, is that that's okay. Because as this principle informs us, the journey into your stories, more often than not, is likely going to be a messy process. So to be forewarned is to be forearmed. Is it a messy process? Yes. Is it kind of scary? Is it intimidating and overwhelming? Yes. But is it a necessary process? Yes. And does God care? Yes. And does God want to help you clean up this mess? Yes. And is God going to go into the mess with you? Yes. And is God faithful? And will He see you through? And can you trust Him on this journey? Yes. So don't be afraid and don't be overwhelmed. And if it's pretty messy along the way, just do your best to keep moving forward. And little by little, you'll be surprised at the progress that you and God can make together. And in the end, I promise you, the journey is going to be worth it. Because God's healing and God's redemption and catharsis are well worth it. And I believe you'll never regret the riches that you're going to receive and the riches that God has in store for you as you take this journey with Him. And if I had to pick a proof text here, you guys, I have an awesome proof text. I'm going to give you a hint. It's Isaiah chapter 45, verse 2 through 3. But I'm not going to read it to you. I'm going to tease you because I see from the clock that I'm running out of time for this episode of the Power of Purity podcast. So I'm going to interrupt Principle 15. We're going to come back in our next episode, and we're going to finish Principle 15 and then move forward to Principle 16 of the 16 principles of understanding your story. So if you want to look it up, if you're curious, look up Isaiah chapter 45, verse 2 through 3, and we'll begin right there next week in our next episode. So in the meantime, let me just close this episode with a quick review of the ground we've covered. We're now through Principle 15 of understanding your story. Principle 1 is that every person's life is made up of many different stories. Principle 2, stories hold power in people's hearts and lives. Principle 3, stories can hold a variety of negative and destructive power within them. Principle 4, the negative and destructive power that lives in people's stories is like poison in their soul. Principle 5, some stories in people's lives hold more power than other stories. Principle 6, stories follow people through their lives. Principle 7, stories layer themselves in people's lives and create life themes. Principle 8, every person's life has many sexual stories. Principle 9, for many people, sex represents the deepest pain and shame of their life. Principle 10, your sexual self is rooted in the stories of your life. Principle 11, God wants to bring His healing to the most hurtful and painful stories of our lives. Principle 12, to experience God's healing in your sexual self will involve you entering a working cooperation with God. Principle 13, to experience God's healing in your heart and life will involve you letting God into the most hurtful and painful stories of your life. Principle 14, 12 suggestions on letting God into your stories. And Principle 15, the journey into your stories is a messy process. And with that being said, you guys, I'm going to close this episode of the Power of Purity podcast. Thank you for being with me. God bless you guys. I'll see you next week in our next episode, and have an awesome day.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.
The Power of Purity Conference. When you're ready to manage your sexual gift in a healthier way. When you're ready to bring your sexual gift under the authority of God. When you're ready to control sex instead of being controlled by sex. The Power of Purity Conference.